First of all, let me say good evening to Giles Duley, and thanks very much, Giles, for agreeing to come to talk to the Contemporary Special Interest Group. You're the fifth of our monthly talks, and I think it's marvelous to think that we've been able to use electronics to keep in touch, and I think this is going to be a much more frequent medium in the future. I think it's going to be an easier way for communication, and I think it's a great idea, and it's good to have you here. Before we get going, I think, Giles, most of us have been aware of your work over the years. You're a man of many parts, I think. Started off doing a lot of pop, and I suppose pop's the wrong word, just showing my age here. Punk, I think, is probably more likely. Photography, very in-your-face stuff. And then, of course, you got into your conflict photography, which led to the unfortunate incident where you were severely injured. And I think all of us here are in awe of the fact that you continued to be a really busy photographer who just happens to have a few problems physically. When we last talked, you'd just come back, you'd just been doing some frantic filming work. Can you talk a bit about what that involves, and then we can look at some of your other stuff. Sean, do you want to stop sharing my screen now, and we can see Giles?
Well, hi everyone. Are we good? We stuck on this one, or
we're good?
Yep. Well, lovely to virtually join everyone this evening. I'm sure everybody's been dealing with all the changes and everything happening. So you have to excuse me. I've literally just run in my door, having to deal with various changes to circumstances because of Tier 4. So excuse me if I'm a little flustered, but I will get my breath back as we go along. Yes, filming. That's what I've been doing actually a lot recently. I've been in Beirut, making a film about food, which is the next step in my process of storytelling. You know, you mentioned that I started out as a music photographer, rock and roll photographer, fashion photographer, portrait photographer, all those different elements. But actually it's the last one I would always say that I've been, which is a portrait photographer. And it doesn't really matter whether I was photographing musicians, bands, people in conflict zones, those living as refugees, people injured by conflict. In my heart, it's always been about portraits. And really that's the core, I guess what keeps me going is a curiosity about people's stories and a desire to share those stories. And so film is the latest way, and food specifically, that I'm interested in. But I was actually there to do a story on refugees living in Lebanon. And I was going to share, I mean, I've told this story before, but I was going to share maybe some of the images from that project, because I think it's an important story in my transition. And what we're going to talk about a bit later, I know, is Vent and the collaborative works and other things that I'm working on. And really, this is the reason why these projects come about. I'm going to do a very clumsy switch to my screen now. Here we go.
Sorry, Sean, before you get going, Giles, everybody on the call, Giles will welcome questions. Please put them in chat, and we'll have stops at regular intervals, and we'll bring up some of the questions. Sean will be bringing them together for us. Thank you. Sorry, Giles.
No, not at all. And I should say, I mean, this is, you know, I do quite a few talks, but this is nice to do something different, which is much more of a conversation and really kind of any questions I'm happy to answer, discuss. And I hope it's something that feels much more of a collaborative engagement. But as I say, I wanted to start just very briefly, and I'll go through these slides quite quickly, but I wanted to explain the transition into the way that I'm working at the moment, why that came about. In 2016, I went to Lebanon to document some of Syria's most vulnerable refugees, single parent families, the elderly, and those living with injuries. And this was particularly poignant for me because this was the first time I had returned fully to work since my own life-changing injuries. And when I say kind of return fully to work, I mean by that I was able to sort of travel, carry all my own gear, work independently. And actually, I'm just going to go back because we need to jump back. Sorry, excuse this. It was actually 2014. So it was just 3 years after I got injured. So it was, as I say, a very important time for me. A lot of people questioned whether I could work still, but this was a story that I was very passionate about because, as I say, I was now telling the stories of people very much the same as me, people that have gone through very similar experiences, people like this woman, Khulud. And Khulud really is the reason, the person that I'm doing the work for now, the reason why I work in the way that I work now. Khulud had been living in Syria when she was shot by a sniper. She was in a garden. She was tending to some vegetables because they were under siege, so she was growing her own crops, and the sniper shot her in the neck. She actually fell on top of one of her own children. She was immediately paralyzed from the neck down. Her family managed to get her out of Syria. They got her emergency medical treatment. But when I met her, she was living in a makeshift tent in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. This tent was made of bits of cardboard, plastic, corrugated metal, even posters ripped down from billboards. If you imagine a tetraplegic woman living in those conditions. So I was incredibly moved by her story. She was an incredibly compassionate woman herself, even though she was living in terrible discomfort. Her concern was always about other people. When I asked her what her hope for the future was, she said, "I just want to be a mother again." On this trip, I met many other people with similar stories. This is Reem, who was injured when a rocket hit her house in Syria. She lost a leg. She was living on the top floor of an unfinished building. The only person that lived with her was her father, Hamed. For those of you who have seen my work before, I tend to shoot against a white background a lot of time to do these portraits, but I always photograph the people looking directly at my camera. But with Ahmed, I was really struggling because every time I went to take his photograph, he would kind of look to the side. We were on this rooftop and it was driving me crazy. And I kept saying, "No, look at me." And he would look out to the side. And eventually I said, "Well, can you explain why you keep looking that way?" And he pointed, and we were on this rooftop, he pointed to these mountains in the distance. And he said, "Giles, you see those mountains?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, that's Syria." He goes, "And I live on this rooftop. So the first thing I see in the morning and the last thing I see at night is my homeland. I'm an old man. I will probably never return home, but at least I can see it." And so Ahmed is the only person I really photographed not looking at my camera, because in that photograph, he is looking out to his homeland. I met a young girl called Aya on this trip, and Aya was living in a very precarious situation. She has spina bifida, meaning she's paralyzed from the waist down. She was just 4 years old. She was living in this terrible tent that was muddy and wet. And I was very dubious about photographing her. I don't like to photograph people as victims. Maybe there's something we can discuss more about, representation of people in these kind of situations. And I was worried that if I photographed Aya, this young girl who was struggling to even sit up in this muddy tent, she would just look like a victim. So I decided not to take her photograph, but just to spend the day with her family, getting to know them. And I realized that actually this younger Aya, despite just being 4 years old, she was not a victim. She was the feistiest 4-year-old I'd ever met in my life. And I soon discovered that she didn't just run her family, she ran the whole refugee camp. She would refer to her sister as Donkey, and she'd say, "Hey, Donkey, pick me up." And we'd walk around the camp and she'd say, "Hey, Donkey, give me water. Donkey, give me bread." And people would do everything for her. And so in the end, this was the photograph I took of her playing hopscotch with her sister. Now, as I say, I don't like to portray people as victims, but showing people laughing, showing people joking, I love to show love, emotions, all the normal things that we expect to see in any family home is what I tend to see in the refugee camps and document. Anyway, so just briefly sort of explaining that this was a very important turning point for me. I did this story. I came back. It was the first time my work was published following my accident, where there was no reference to me. It was really when I got my life back. And over the next few years, I returned to work full time. And until 2016, I was commissioned by the UNHCR to document the refugee crisis across the Middle East and Europe. This was at a time when Sadly, we were seeing scenes such as this, as boats landing in Lesbos, the German route, people traveling through the Balkans. And the UNHCR gave me this amazing commission to basically document the crisis wherever I needed to go over a period of a year. Now, as I'm sure, as many of you have experienced, when you get a brief for a large project, this can go into pages and pages of notes and ideas and requirements. And I actually got given the greatest assignment note ever. The UNHCR commissioned me and they said, simply follow your heart. And that was my project for the year. So as well as documenting scenes that we're very familiar with, I knew I'd have to go back to Lebanon and see some of those families that I'd met 2 years before. So in 2016, that's what I did. I went back to see my friend Ahmed. I always like to take photographs back with me. I think it's a nice thing to give to people to show them how you told their story. But Ahmed actually wasn't very pleased when I gave him his photograph. He just told me I made him look really old in this. But Reem and her family were living on the rooftop. She had more of a family with her. Life had returned to some kind of normalcy. I also went and met Aya and caught up with her. She was as feisty as ever. This was her being pushed by her brother. She was screaming, "Faster, donkey, faster." But really the reason I wanted to share this story briefly was to then explain what happened on the last day I was there. I got a phone call and it was from Khulud, or Jamal, her husband, the woman who'd been paralyzed by the sniper's bullet. And they said, "We hear you're back in Lebanon and we'd love to see you." And I asked the question, well, where are you now? Because I naively had assumed there was no way that they were in the same tent where I'd photographed them 2 years before. And they said, "No, we're in the same place." And I remember feeling physically sick. I kind of asked the question again, "No, where are you now though?" And they said the same place. And when I went to see them the next day, I actually burst into tears when I walked in and I saw Khulud, because I said, "I failed you." And this is the really important point for me, at least as a photographer. I naively, maybe arrogantly thought, if I take a photograph of somebody in a terrible situation and that photograph gets published, appears around the world, people see it, charities used it, the UN used those images, surely something would change for the people in those photographs. So to discover that nothing had changed made me question the whole purpose of what I do. I resolved just to go back and to photograph them again and try and do a better job. And I spent the next week every day with Khulud and Jamal. They're an amazing couple. Jamal, when he's in this little kitchen, he'll often whisper to me his greatest fear is that Khulud does not love him as much as he loves her. There's always laughter. And despite all their hardships, you kind of leave feeling uplifted. But you imagine for Khulud, she had not left this bed in 2 years, just staring at the same bit of ceiling, no windows, no air. In the winter, it's freezing cold. In the winter, suffocatingly hot. On the last day I was there, I had a difficult decision because I was sitting there looking at this scene, and in my bag, I had the photograph that I had taken 2 years before. And I thought, if I give them this photograph, which looks identical to the scene in front of me, won't it remind them that nothing has changed? But I thought, no, I have to give them that photograph. So I went into my bag and I took out the photograph and I handed them this image that I'd taken 2 years before. But when I handed it to Khulud, I said, when I took this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a refugee. I did not take a photograph of a woman with a disability. When I took this photograph, I took a photograph of a couple who are in love. And this for me is a photograph of love. Now, the reason I wanted to share this story, and I've spoken about this project in more depth, but the reason I wanted to share it with you this evening is because this was the turning point for me. Because after seeing Khulud and realizing that my photographs had made no difference, I realized it was no longer just enough to be a photographer, to be a photojournalist, to do my job and just hand those photographs over to somebody else. I needed to make sure that something happened. I needed to make sure that there was impact, that lives changed because of the work that I was doing. And really, that's where the idea for collaborating, for working with other artists, with getting the stories out in non-traditional means came about. So in fact, I came back with that story. I worked with the band Massive Attack. We used the visuals of those photographs in live shows. I teamed up with a couple of actors that I knew in the States who promoted that story through crowdfunding campaigns. And eventually, those photographs, without actually being published anywhere, were used in other campaigns directly to raise funds for Khulud and the family. And we raised $250,000. And we were able to rehouse the families and give them another chance at being a normal family. So as I say, that's kind of just a very brief, slightly rambly introduction to what it was, the story in particular, that changed the way that I work. You know, after years of probably 20 years up to that point of always thinking my job is to take photographs and then hand them over to somebody else, I realized if I really wanted to create some kind of change, I would also have to make sure that I was involved in the storytelling element.
So it's a very powerful message to all of us. I think there is an assumption that we see photographs like the ones you've taken in Lebanon and they do make a difference. And if they don't, what does it say about society if we have to, if you feel you have to go back and use a different approach, which is having a result? Well,
I think the point for me was, I would say when I set out, you know, we spoke briefly that I started as a music photographer. I then went to try and document stories about conflict. I would say I was not really a photojournalist. I was an angry man with a camera. You know, I went out there because I wanted to create some kind of change. And maybe having grown up in the shadow of great photographers like Don McCullen and people that really, those photographs that had huge impact around the world, I believed that a photograph on its own could make a difference. And increasingly, I saw that my photographs would be published and, you know, they would get shared on social media and people would share the story, but nothing would actually make any difference. And I guess it was quite a hard decision for me to focus on what it was that I was trying to achieve. Because I think as a photographer, you know, the goal was you want to be your photograph published in the New York Times or you want to be on the cover of the Sunday Times magazine. That was the aim. But then you kind of step back and you go, is that really what I want to do? Would I be happier if one of my photographs appeared on a small crowdfunding campaign that raised money and changed somebody's life? Or for it to appear and for me to win a Pulitzer and nothing to change? And the reality is, I would be happy if that picture appeared somewhere and I never even got a credit, but something changed. And I guess that was the turning point in what my perspective was of what success meant.
I noticed you were back in Lebanon this year, just after the horrific explosion in Beirut. Were you involved in trying to help the people there directly?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of friends that live there. We support, as I say, quite a few refugee families that obviously been impacted. They've had the economic crisis, they've had COVID, and they've had the explosion. I mean, they really have had, you know, 3 sort of monumental, life-changing crises this year. So we were doing some work with cooking, food, distribution, that side of things, raising funds for that. It's an amazing country, you know, very resilient country, but resilience comes from suffering. So, you know, resilience is a quality you don't always want to find in people. And unfortunately, the Lebanese have bags of resilience.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a great question from Stuart Wall here. So it's really asking if you know about the work of Giles Penfound or Martin Middlebrook. Really a good comment here about Martin Middlebrook said that conflict photojournalism is something where if he felt he was photographing the darkness, he was perpetuating the darkness. And he's wondering if he's commenting on the propaganda of war. So what's your thinking about this? You know, photograph the darkness or the light?
We see, I mean, here's an interesting question to kind of throw back, and one that I often query myself, but I don't know if there is such a thing as an anti-war photograph. And I say that as somebody that grew up, I was really interested in the military, and, you know, I loved the history of conflicts and military history. And I think when you have an interest in those things, like a film, for example, like Apocalypse Now. You know, Apocalypse Now was made as an anti-war film. But as a teenager growing up, I kind of watched it and thought it was kind of cool. You know, the shots of helicopters coming into the ride of the Valkyries. It's all very stirring. And so, you know, for me, if I was to photograph somebody firing a machine gun in the street, I know that there's a teenage kid somewhere looking at that gun, kind of seeing that as exciting, stimulating. It's only really an anti-war image when you've reached that conclusion yourself that war is this terrible act and the violence that goes with it. So I never photograph any weapons, tanks, explosions, all of that side of things. I completely avoid that side of it all because I'm not saying it's not important, and it's great that photographers are out there documenting that. But from my perspective, I don't think I can take a photograph that some way doesn't perpetuate somehow the allure or the glamour that does exist in war. So, you know, increasingly I try and photograph what you're saying, the light. It's hard because I do photograph people that have gone through incredibly difficult personal stories. But that's actually why food is becoming really important to me. I have a little mantra that I won't actually photograph anyone now if I haven't eaten with them first. And, you know, that can be quite chaotic. I was in Mosul, which a few years ago was involved heavy fighting between the Iraqi government and ISIS. And the city was absolutely destroyed. It was the worst thing I'd ever seen. And I visited a family, and I'd been told that they'd gone through a particularly difficult experience. And when I arrived at their door, the grandmother of the family was there screaming at me, screaming about what had happened. And essentially the story was that the father of the family had been on the roof and a rocket had hit the house and he'd been killed. A few days later, the grandfather was in the garden when a mortar shell landed. And finally, a few days after that, the mother was killed by a sniper as she cooked in the kitchen. And the house itself looked like a sort of set from a Tom Hanks war movie. It was burnt, it was sort of smashed windows, bullet holes in the wall. And it was really a place of horror. But I kept saying to the grandmother, look, please, you don't need to tell me the story. I've just come here to cook with you. And you could see her kind of do this double take. She's like, why is this a one-armed English guy come halfway around the world to a war zone to cook with me? And she took it back and then she carried on talking. I said, no, please, grandmother, please understand. I said, my grandmother was Italian. She's no longer with us, but I need a new grandmother to teach me how to cook. Please, can I come back tomorrow and cook with you? And for the first time, she kind of stopped, took a breath, and she smiled and she said, okay. And so I went back the next day. I turned up. All I could find in Mosul that day was a frozen chicken and a bag of rice. And it turned out this grandmother was actually one of the worst cooks I've ever met. We spent the first hour trying to break this chicken with like a hammer and splinters of chicken flying everywhere. But we cooked with the 3 grandchildren and her. And even in the midst of this horror, and it's literally in the room where the mother had been killed just a few weeks before, there was some sense of calm. And that's what we did that day. And it was just about being present with someone and respecting someone. And I didn't even take my camera out the bag that day, and then returned a couple of days later to take some photographs, to make some photographs. And so, yeah, that sense of trying to look for light, what I guess I try and look for is love and humanity. And for me, food is now the way I connect to people's stories, because it's something that all of us share. All of us know what it's like to sit around a table with our family and to share a meal.
It's interesting you talk about the moment where your attitude to all this changed. I'm reminded of the famous photograph that George Roger took of the little boy in Belsen. And for him, that was the last thing. That was the thing that changed him, that he was so busy taking photographs and doing the composition that all these bodies lying around and this one little boy alive. They actually found him about 50 years later. He survived, and despite the starvation they'd had. So do you think that with photographers, or some photographers, that there comes a point where they feel that it's all about humanity and less about the conflict?
You know, it's a really difficult one, because you know, when you see some of these terrible things going on, you want people to be angry. You want people in the world to see, in South Sudan, a child soldier who's just been shot, a 12-year-old boy who's been injured because he was forced to fight. And you're angry about it and you want the world to see it. And I understand why photographers do that. If you don't do that, if you choose to show, I mean, a woman called Melissa Fleming, who's the chief spokesperson for the United Nations, she described my work, and I think she meant it as a compliment, but the banality of my stories, the fact that I was showing the everyday amongst the chaos. But the problem is, then you're not going to get those pictures as seen. Those images are not going to be on the front pages of newspapers and magazines. Mm. So you have this challenge of you want the story to be out there, but you also want to do it in a way that you feel is appropriate and with dignity. But then you will be restricted. You know, a good example was 5 years ago, I was in Idomeni, which is the border crossing between Greece and Macedonia. And they had just shut the border. And I often use this example of the idea of what is truth in photography, because I don't believe there's such a thing as truth. I think there can be honesty, but not truth. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you put me in a room and I take a photograph, I've immediately ruled out what's behind me. I've made a choice at that moment to take that picture. I've told you my interpretation of what is happening there. So in this moment in Idomeni, there were 2,000 refugees and people, asylum seekers, all types of people with different reasons stuck on the border. And there were probably 200 young guys, mainly from Morocco and Tunisia, that were rioting. And it was obvious what was going to become the big story. And a lot of the world's top photographers, like Jim Natchway was there, and everybody was there focusing on this riot and 200 people, throwing bricks. And of course, that's an important part of the story. But if you say there's 2,000 people, there was 1,800 people hiding away from it in their tents who were scared of what was going on. And I was actually with a Yemeni family having tea and having mint tea, and they were telling me their fears about this riot. Now, I took photographs of them. The reality is my photographs of them having tea were never going to be on the front pages of papers around the world the next day. And the next day, the covers of all these papers were of these people throwing bricks and the violence that was happening at this border crossing. Now, what is the truth? Both of those things were true. Both of those things happened. But for me, I was representing the majority of people, but I also was aware that my pictures wouldn't have the impact and wouldn't be published in the same way that others were. So this is, I guess, the constant challenge we face.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a good question from John Sanchez, which he says he understands and empathizes with the desire to use work to bring about change. He asks, is there any value in conflict or other photography which simply bears witness to events?
I think it's important that there is that history. I've got to know, I was inspired to become a photographer by the work of Don McCullen. I mean, it was a direct impact at 18 years old, being given a book of his photographs and saying to myself, that's why I want to be a photographer. And I'm fortunate enough to have sat on a few panels with him and got to know him. And I know for his view is that the photographs he's taken in a way have no purpose. There was no point because war still carries on. So what was the point of the photographs he did of, say, the Vietnam War if war carries on to this day? And my answer to that would be we don't know it would also be like if those pictures had never been taken. Unfortunately, there's never going to be a photograph that's going to stop war. There's never going to be that one image. I would love to think there was a magic photograph that somebody would take that the next day everybody would wake up and realize that war was a terrible thing. Unfortunately, there isn't. So I look at it much more that we can have little impacts. Somebody came to an exhibition of mine once and they said, do you think you can change the world with your photographs? And I said, no, but maybe I can inspire the person that can. And I think that's really all that I see, my role is if I can just make one person change their opinion. I had a letter a few years ago from a kid in Australia, and he wrote and he said, dear Mr. Duley, I just wanted to let you know I got into Brisbane Medical School. First, I was like, well, thanks for letting me know. And I read on, and he said, I struggled at school. I was told I was not smart enough, but I wanted to let you know I got a scholarship. And he said, it was one of your photographs that inspired me. The photograph you'd taken in Afghanistan was on my wall above my desk. And that's what I looked at every day to remind me of why I wanted to become a doctor. And in a way, if I had never taken another photograph after that, I would have done what I set out to do, which is maybe change one opinion. So I think we have to accept that photographs are not going to stop war, but we don't know the effect of the images that we do take and how that will impact people.
Yeah, really good.
It was when we talked last week, I'd had a brief look at your website, and we talked about the picture of Mosul, and I said about the street and how I'd been to a German post office museum in 1989 before the wall came down, and I think we talked about the Trümmer Photographic. I think I've looked it up. Unfortunately, I've got a German-speaking wife who got my pronunciation right. But the thing about what got me about the photography in Germany, and to some extent that photograph of Mosul, was the fact that people were getting on with their lives despite the utter devastation. Just a pile of bricks to make a wall, to make a shop in Berlin. People moving, using old prams to move things around. There is a big purpose to that sort of photography. I think that it shows the resilience of people as much as anything else, and the fact that people's lives do go on despite war. And does that chime with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that is the role of photography, is also, I think, to be document. The work you're talking about, which I did in Mosul, was a direct kind of response to the photographs I'd seen taken in 1945 in places like Munich, Cologne, Berlin. Many of the great photographers, from Chim to Kappa, Lee Miller, so many photographers, and a lot of German photographers documented that rubble. Now, it's interesting because what was their reasoning behind it? The war had ended. It wasn't action photographs. Most of those photographers have been involved in actually documenting the fighting for the 5 years leading up to that. Some incredibly dramatic pictures. What drew so many of those photographers to document the rubble? And I think there was a sense of the realization of just the collapse of cities, the destruction, but also, as you say, that element of people immediately starting to rebuild. But also, I think it represents the mindlessness of conflict. There is something bleak about seeing these fantastic and beautiful cities absolutely destroyed by, the ego of men, the idea of war, what it means, but the outcome is always the same: destruction. And I was in Mosul, and Mosul was, the university city of Iraq, a place of learning, and to see really it looking identical to what Berlin looked like in 1945. I set out to do a series of photographs, really kind of reflecting those images. Also because, again, I'm interested in this idea of legacy, that things do carry on the same. So people often say to me about the Middle East, come on, they're always fighting. It's what they do. And you go, well, have you not remember European history? Have you not, studied here? And so to put photographs next to each other that were almost identical, I almost copied some of the photographs I'd seen of Cologne particularly, and sort of replicated those in the way that I photographed Mosul. So that I'm hoping to do an exhibition. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be at the UN this year, but obviously things changed. But the exhibition will lay photographs from 1945 and last year of Mosul next to each other, and you really can't tell the difference. Does that achieve anything? Does anything change from that? Unfortunately not. But at least I feel like I've done my role, which is to document something.
I think that will be very powerful to see. Yeah. So a question then, you said right at the beginning that the lady that you went to take the picture of when she was in her bed, the picture of love, and then you took a picture of her in a tent in the refugee camp, and 2 years later she was still there. And this work was for the UNHCR or facilitated by them? Was it really to help them, or were they helping you? So
it was working with, the first part of the project was actually with the charity Humanity Inclusion, which used to be called Handicap International. And I was just there visiting some of the people that they were working with, and they'd given her some rehabilitation, but they weren't actually working with her anymore. What I tend to do with NGOs is what I would call collaboration. So I don't do commissions in the sense of somebody ringing me up and saying, go and photograph this, this, and this. I work on a collaboration where they introduce me to people. I still have the freedom to work in the way that I want to work. So, for example, when I did that year-long project for the UNHCR, there was no photographs of UNHCR workers and things like that. It's a kind of collaborative process, which has taken many years to build up that kind of relationship. But at the end of the day, you know, that's the frustrating element, is that you want those photographs to have an impact. And, you know, maybe I should step back and just look at it and think it's the bigger impact, it's the impact, you know, of raising funds, of awareness. But I also look more macroly and think, well, what about the impact on the actual people that have trusted me with their stories? And it's interesting, in fact, that story of Khulud, because I photographed her the first time. When I went back, if truth be told, it was when I was doing the project for the UNHCR, but they said, we don't want you to go and photograph those families again because that story's already been told. And this is one of the things that I do quite a lot, which is go back, and you do find that people, magazines, newspapers will say, well, we're not interested if you've already done that story. But my feeling is stories don't stop when we leave. As a journalist or a photographer, a filmmaker, those stories carry on for those people. And I've become increasingly interested in documenting stories over years. So a lot of the Syrian families I know in Lebanon, I've been documenting their stories for nearly 10 years now. And some of them have moved to Holland, some to move to France. Many are still living in the Bekaa Valley, some in Tripoli in northern Lebanon. And I keep going back to tell those stories because I think it's another way of looking at stories that we don't necessarily look at. You know, we look at them in fractions of a second rather than looking at them over longer periods of time. So interestingly, actually, the final part of Khulud's story, the woman that was paralyzed, was that I had an exhibition in Geneva just over a year ago. And it was on the shores of Lake Geneva. And a lot of the heads of the UNHCR and UN bodies and all the rest of it were invited to the opening. And I actually bought Khulud in her wheelchair. She now has this kind of wheelchair that she can operate herself, to come and open the exhibition and speak at it. And for me, that was the ultimate kind of giving power, I guess, the person who's in the story. Was in this exhibition, these stories of her, she was the one that actually opened and introduced the exhibition.
Yeah, really, really good. Linked to that idea of following through a family that you've met in wartime and how they make progress. Not so much a question, but I've got a comment here from Ray Hobbs, who says he has a project documenting how refugees are maintaining their identity and culture in Wales. He's interested in contacting you after the presentation, so I can pass on his email address to you. Yeah, that's really.
You know, I think it is really interesting, this element of time. You know, you mentioned, Alan, that I was in Lebanon recently, and one of the people I saw there was a young girl called Khwala. And when I met her, it was 6 years ago. She was 12 years old. And I actually didn't tell her story at the time because it was quite a traumatic story. She'd actually tried to kill herself with rat poison because she'd seen a lot of her friends killed in Syria. She'd heard her mother saying that she was struggling to feed everybody. So she thought if she killed herself, her mother would find it easier and her siblings would have more food. And I took her photograph, but I didn't publish the story because I felt she was still too vulnerable. And although she'd wanted to tell me the story, we didn't publish it. And now she's 17. Now she's 17, and I've been going back and seeing her regularly. In fact, I managed to rehouse her family for the last 5 years. And so now we're actually telling her story as part of this film I was doing. And now it's a joyous story. You know, we were cooking on the beach together. There was laughter, there was joking. And I think there's something very powerful about, you can see that transition from the terrible circumstances she was in to where she is now. And I think increasingly I want to give people more hope in those stories. You know, it's like you sort of slap people with the reality of these situations. And now more so than ever, people know the world is a pretty challenging place. You know, everyone's going through their own challenges. And I don't think we need to be constantly reminded of the brutality of war and the violence and what it's like for refugees. And it's overwhelming. And so what I'm trying to do is find ways to tell stories that are still powerful, but also lead you to maybe some of the answers and to some of the hope. And as you mentioned, Alan, the resilience of people, because maybe that's something that we can learn from and build on and see more of a kind of commonality. But I think you need time to be able to tell those kind of stories.
Yeah, it's a good comment from Patricia. She was a US citizen living in the US during the Vietnam Wars and found that the war photos really brought home what was going on. And I guess, you know, back in the 60s and early 70s, it was perhaps more difficult to see that than it is now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, exactly that. I mean, I think the photographs that came out, you in late 1944 of the first concentration camps that were photographed. I think those really shocked people. I think the photographs during the Vietnam War was one of the first times that pictures were seen publicly that criticized the military. Not necessarily criticized them as individuals, but criticized the sort of the policy, the question of why are we there? That was never really done before in photographs. And I have no doubt, and interestingly, having worked with them, I know for sure that the US military has no doubt that what turned the tide against the US was photographs, was people seeing those images. That's why after the Vietnam War, the US military became much tighter on the way that they controlled the way that photographers and journalists work, because they felt that's what turned the tide of war against, or tide of that war against them. So I have no doubt that those pictures had that impact. I think it's a combination now that we don't have the access to maybe take some of those type of photographs. It's a different types of conflict. They're much more remote now. You don't see what's happening on the other side. And also maybe that, people have become, I don't think desensitized, but things don't have the same impact when they've been seen before, when a generation seen them has impacted them if they happen again.
Before we started, you said you had some other bits of work you'd like to share with us. You got another story that we could...
Yeah, I mean, let me just grab, I'm just going to flick through some photographs just purely for the, see if we can, give me 1 second, just switching.
Maybe we can have a quick word about the Vent project that I was fascinated by.
Yeah. So, there we go. Let me just shut that one down. So, the joys of technology. We're all learning.
For those of you who are on the call, while Giles is getting this up, he was telling me the other day that when he goes to places like Mosul, he uses film because he can't get his batteries charged for digital. Much easier to use film.
Yeah, that actually links very nicely to a question from Sagar Bakalar, was how much equipment do you carry in the field?
I'm kind of my own worst enemy. I used to just work with like a Canon EOS, the last film cameras that they made. And then I started wanting to do more medium format work. So I used to have a Contact 645 that I traveled with, but now I've gone to Hasselblad. And Hasselblads are quite sensitive cameras. They don't really like being thrown around and casted. And for a guy that's got no legs and one arm, carrying like a whole Hasselblad kit, a whole Canon kit, a big white background thing that I hang up, I've sort of become, my own worst enemy, where I have quite a lot of this kit. But I would say that actually there is quite an advantage in having film cameras, because although they are sensitive, like especially the Hasselblad, they're still a lot less delicate than a lot of digital cameras. And I don't need my laptop, I don't need hard drives, I don't need to be backing stuff up every night. I remember when I was in Lesvos, I showed a photograph earlier when it was the height of the things happening in Lesvos, the whole kind of, I've never really worked with other photojournalists, but all the big photojournalists were there. And every evening there would be a mad rush to the one cafe that had decent internet, because everybody had to upload their photographs. I would just pop along to the post office, stick my films in an envelope and head down to the bar about 3 hours before everybody else. So there was a definite advantage to having film there. These I'm just going to go through. This is the project I'm working on a lot at the moment called Vent. And Vent came about because, again, this idea of collaboration. How do we make our stories louder? How do we make people hear what's going on more? And I'm really interested in working with other artists. And again, it was something maybe I had to challenge myself, my own preciousness. As photographers, we can be very precious about our photographs. I can spend hours getting everything exactly right. I don't like things to be cropped. I don't like anything to be changed when it's published. And so to sort of set out a project where basically I said to other artists, feel free to destroy my images. Feel free to rip them up, to cut them up. But the only thing you need to respect is the story, not the photograph. And it's been really interesting to see. This is by an artist called Lamia, who again just took my images. We set up a website so that people could just download the photographs themselves and could then set about creating these new stories. And what I find interesting is, that's one set of pictures, and then you get like another artist using actually pretty similar images, same photographs. This is Mike McQuaid, who again did something completely different with the stories. And another artist called Jonathan, who took, these are the same photographs as the last set, but created a whole different feel, a whole different story. So collaboration is something that I find really, really exciting, because people take the photographs that I'm so familiar with and then go off and create something completely new. And then I see those stories in a new light. And I definitely think, this year has been particularly good for me for collaboration, because, as you said, Alan, at the beginning of this, with things like Zoom, we're suddenly being able to connect with people in different ways. And when I couldn't travel for my work, I decided to use this opportunity to connect with other artists. And I definitely think it's something worth exploring. It's something I've certainly enjoyed and gained a huge amount from, is doing some of these collaborations. And in terms of, let me see if I've got, again, this is stuff I've done with musicians, where we put stuff up. This is food. So now at exhibitions myself, I tend to always have meals. This was an exhibition I did at the Truman Brewery a few years ago. And it was this sort of large exhibition. And about 2 weeks before the exhibition, I rang up my agent and I said, I've got this idea. Why don't we have 1,000 people eat with us at the exhibition? And he kind of laughed in a kind of slightly nervous way and said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, we could have 100 people every day sit and eat. And again, this is trying to take the element of photographs where, for me, exhibitions can be quite what I would call chapel experiences, where people kind of go in very reverentially and very quiet, and they whisper in front of the photographs. And I wanted people to take action because of the photographs. So I thought, well, if everybody sat and ate with us every night, then maybe we get some discussions going. So we had what I called the wedding table, and we had 100 people sit every night. We had an amazing Syrian couple that cooked for us. There wasn't even a sink at this place. We had to bring in buckets of water, and volunteers kind of cleaned up. But over the course of 10 days, we had 1,000 people sit and eat with us at this exhibition.
Brilliant.
And again, this is another example of doing something completely different, where I worked with the musician PJ Harvey, and another artist took the photographs to make this music video, which used zooming in and zooming out on images. And I could go on, but I think for me, it's been a really exciting process in the last few years of just finding ways to take my images, which are very traditional, black and white, shot on film, and then working with other artists to take them into maybe a more modern and contemporary context. Most importantly, what that means is that people that would have come and looked at my photographs would never have heard the stories, are now discovering those projects.
I've got a question from Abhijit about, well, I'll read out a statement. As a doctor, I'm impressed by your London Imperial College Hospital COVID-19 pictures. Can you tell us a few words about that project and how you got permission to do it?
That was interesting. So obviously, like everybody else, when the first lockdown happened, all the projects I was planning to do stopped. And I actually got a phone call from the head of trauma at Imperial, Shihan Heterachi, and he was actually one of the surgeons that saved my life. And with him and a few other of the teams there, they felt, and this is actually getting back to kind of a good question, because it gets us back to what we were talking about, this idea of documentation. And they felt that what was happening at that moment, this was kind of March, so April, May of this year, what was happening was historic and needed to be documented. But the challenge was they weren't really allowing photographers in because there were concerns about privacy and all the different other things in government. So, everybody knows the NHS is very politicized. There was shortages of PPE. So there was all this kind of tension going on. And what a lot of the NHS medical staff were worried about was that they were going to not have this documentation. So I agreed to go and work with Imperial NHS on a kind of proviso that the photographs would not be published until everybody had agreed how they would be used. The important thing was to get there and to document what was happening. And so that really was my brief. What was interesting is that I was working alongside medical teams. My friend Sheehan has said that the surgeon, but also other staff that had actually saved my life. It was quite challenging for me. I spent a lot of time in intensive care with ARDS, which is basically the same condition that people have been dying from with COVID. So I was back in the intensive care wards that I had been a patient in myself. But I think that gave me an insight that maybe other people wouldn't have had. And so, yeah, that's really what it was. And now people like the London Museum, the NHS themselves have taken on the whole series as exactly that, as a document. And interestingly, they've had them printed as prints and now in the archive as a kind of COVID collection. And also what was important for me there was not just to photograph the intensive care units, because that was one part of the story, but I also documented things, everybody from the cleaners, the porters, their daily life, sitting in the canteen with medical staff, having a laugh after their shift, talking. I did long form recorded interviews that go with the photographs. And really that's what the purpose was to create a document of a historical moment for the NHS. And really it was a small gift back to the staff that had saved my life.
Great, lovely idea. We've actually been putting together a series of our own blogs using members of the group and other professionals, and people have been contributing to a series we've done covering exactly that, the impact in the hospitals and in the country. So maybe we can put a few words together and link to your project.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great.
We got any more questions from anybody, Sean?
Well, that's covered it so far. There's a few comments about thank you for such an inspirational talk, which it certainly has been.
Absolutely. Too much to take on in one instant. The Vent project, going back to that, I've noticed looking at your website, it's still up there for people to download it. Do you welcome input from other people?
You know what? I think it's an interesting thing for me. Photographers, we tend to be loners. I mean, I know we're all chatting here tonight, but one of the things I've loved about photography is the independence it's given me. From the age of 18, my whole life has been as a photographer, traveling and being able to do my own thing. And for example, making films is something I can only do once in a while, because it's something I'm working with a team and you have all these discussions. And in fact, I've been presenting and sort of co-producing this last series. And it's quite funny because I get sent the outtakes when I'm on my microphone, sort of mumbling away about I'm sick of being filmed and blah, 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 and all these other people. But it's interesting. The collaborative process, I think, is really rewarding. And as I say, as a photographer for so many years, I've always worked in isolation and been very happy with that. But Vent was about reaching out and getting other people to challenge me and to bring ideas. And it's taken on its own sort of life. So, I've had photographers get in contact, say, look, I'm really inspired by what you're doing, but does my photograph work with it? Or a playwright or a musician get in contact and say, I've done this. So it's kind of taking on its own life form. I kind of think of it, it's a bit like a Frankenstein project, where all these elements come along, and I keep saying that Frankenstein's behind me, and you kind of keep throwing all the parts, and then you turn around and you look and go, oh, that's what it looks like. And it does have its own life. So yeah, I'm interested in creatives of all sorts of getting in contact, but I also hope it inspires other people to do similar things. As I say, I think there's something just very rewarding about taking your photograph and sharing it with somebody else and seeing how they interpret it and what happens to it and what that then becomes with somebody else.
It's interesting you say that. You remind me of a conversation I had with Seamus Heaney, who was talking about his poetry and hearing other people perform it. And someone said to him, well, do you not have a view on these things? And his view was, well, no, I finished with it. It's now out there in the world for other people to do with it as they feel, as long as they don't abuse it. But their way of performing it is their way of interpreting what he's written. So
Well, exactly. And I think what's important for me is it's the story is the precious part, and other people interpreting it. So what's been really moving for me, as well as I'm starting and trying to find more and more connections with artists who actually are from the conflict zones that I have been working in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting for me when I'm starting to see now, artists from Libya or from Rwanda taking the photographs that I've created from their countries and then reinterpreting them back there. That for me is really exciting.
Hmm. Did you ever come across our previous speaker? Last month we had a young Egyptian woman called Rahab Eldail, who was involved in the Arab Spring and that got her involved. Across her work.
I know her work, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. What my own small charity, we always try and use photographers from the countries that we're working in. I think there's nothing for me. Having more people behind the camera, more diversity means we get to see a wider picture for all of us. So I think it's really interesting. But as I say, it's also interesting because there can be a sort of a sense of, as me traveling from the UK, going to, say, Rwanda, taking photographs, coming back is my interpretation of that country. What's really interesting for me is then somebody in Rwanda taking the photographs I've made there and then creating something new from that with their insight. It kind of means that it becomes a more multi-layered thing. For me, is a huge sign, something that I'm very grateful for, that somebody sees images that I've done or stories that I've told from the country that they live in and feel that represents, but they can also bring another element to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, unless Sean, we got I've got lots of comments coming through. Any more questions for Giles before we wrap up?
There's one last one, which is really about practical aspects, I guess, is do we need model releases when taking images from these war-affected countries?
It's really an interesting question because, like, for example, making a film, when you make a film, it's incredibly strict, all the releases that need to be signed. So even somebody who's in the background, if I'm sitting having a meal, anybody in that restaurant that might appear has to sign a release. Photography, there are gray areas where obviously, for example, if you're photographing somebody in a conflict zone and guns are going off, you can't stop and get model releases and signed off things. And also there's an element where sometimes if I've been documenting a family for years, to actually ask them to sign something that basically says, I can use this image for whatever I want, blah, 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 can actually damage that relationship you have with somebody.
Yeah.
So, I work very much on a trust level, that the people that I photographed, it has been over a long period of time. There's great apps now that you can use to get releases done that convert it into different languages so that people can read it and also hear it. Because a lot of these model releases that I've seen, even charities using, are written in English, possibly in Arabic, but often given to people that can't read and just told to sign it. There's a really dangerous power balance as well, because most of my work, I'm traveling with a charity. And if a charity that is literally feeding somebody or housing somebody says, can you sign this so this photographer can use it? People will tend to worry that if they don't sign it, they're going to get in trouble. So there's a lot of complex power dynamics with all this. So I'm very dubious about them. Unfortunately, the nature of my work, because I'm working with NGOs and charities, they always insist on getting them, and their staff will be there to get these signed. But as I say, I do worry about it because I think there is if literally the person that feeds you asks you to sign something, people will tend to do it. So I'm not even sure how much faith I put in them. It's not a very good answer. It's a very complex thing.
Yeah, the ethics of it are really challenging and interesting.
Yeah. And also I've seen photographers and filmmakers who lead people on saying, me telling you your story can change your life, things will happen, sign this, let me do what you want. It's difficult. Yeah,
and there's the payout on that, this will change your life, but 2 years from now, you might still be sitting in this tent. Yeah, really. But on the positive side, we've got lots of great comments of people thanking you for a very inspirational talk.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you all.
Yeah, it's been really good.
Right, well, unless we've got any more, I shall just share my screen and just...
Well, there's one last one, which is kind of another practical one, is do you ever have problems with customs when you're carrying lots of film?
You know what? Customs hate me because I've already got 2 prosthetic legs setting off every alarm. And then when they've dealt with that, I then say, I've also got 2 bags full of film that you've got to hand check as well. So I'm kind of like, I'm quite well known at places like Heathrow and Gatwick. They tend to recognize me and go, oh, it's him again. So yeah, I tend to be the bane of security's lives. I use these bags actually. So I always carry my film as hand luggage, and I have sort of lead-lined bags that I put all the film in, and that normally goes through. It sets everything off, and then they swab it on the other side, and that system's worked for me. I never used to get when I was doing all the fashion and music photography. I never used to get film fogged, but my understanding, and actually, Rapiscan, one of the companies, I did a talk, funny enough, for them 2 years back. That the scanners these days are slightly stronger or slightly different because they don't have to worry normally about people's films, so they do tend to fog it more now than they used to. But as I say, I use these little lead-lined bags. But yeah, the combination of 2 prosthetic legs setting off every alarm and a bag full of film means I am not the most. You don't want to be stood behind me. Let's put it that way in the queue.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. In normal times, I'm traveling every week to different parts of the world. Yeah.
I've also got a passport that's got, you know, every sort of dubious country you can imagine stamped in there as well. So yeah, I set off pretty much every alarm going.
Yeah, we can share some good stories about that.
Right, well, I'm just going to share my screen and say thank you so much to Giles. We could go on all night, I think. And I know you've had an extremely busy day, and thank you so much for rushing in the door, literally, still puffing and panting, sitting down and talking so amazingly to us. It's been a fascinating evening. And so I'd like to just say thank you again for your insight. And really, to me, the humanity that you've managed to bring out in your photography says it all as far as I'm concerned. Thanks to Deshaun for capturing the questions. And just a quick invitation, next month we've got Carolyn Mendelsohn, who's, I noticed was on tonight, is coming to talk to us. And the event registration for that is now available. So Giles, just to say again, thank you so much. You can stop sharing, Sean. That would be good. So yet again, saying just thank you so much for coming to talk to us this evening. It's been a marvelous insight into your work.
Pleasure.
I must go and find even more of it.
No, pleasure. I know it's a difficult and challenging time, but I hope everybody can have as happy a Christmas as is possible in these circumstances.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. And have a very pleasant Christmas. And we'll see you in 2021. Let's hope it's much more comfortable than 2020 has been. Right. Thank you. Good night. Bye.